Hello again and welcome back. I am Jared Case, curator of film exhibitions at the Dryden Theater and the George Eastman Museum, with another streaming recommendation for you. I'm lucky enough to have yet another special guest to talk with me today. His name is Brian Meacham. He is a 2006 graduate of the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Jared. Great to be here.
So you are working at the Yale Film Archive. Can you tell us a little bit about that position, how you got there?
Sure. So the Yale Film Archive is an archive located at Yale University. We are part of the Yale University Library, and we are, I guess, a sort of small, fairly recent academic film archive. The archive traces its roots back to a film collection that was acquired by Yale in the late 1960s. People had started teaching film, and they wanted to have a collection on hand so they didn't have to keep borrowing from the Museum of Modern Art and Brandon Films and other distributors of the day. And so people at the university, some film enthusiasts, a history of art professor and experimental filmmaker Standish Lauder got together and arranged for the funds to purchase a collection of films from a film collector named John Griggs, called the Griggs Collection of Classic Films. And so from that collection of 200 films back in the late 1960s, we've grown to more than probably 7,000 films currently. And in 1982, we were sort of officially established as the Yale Film Studies Center, which is a name that some people might know us under. And just last month, we officially became the Yale Film Archive. And so we have a huge video collection, circulating video that is used by faculty and students and researchers here at Yale. And then we have the film half, or the film side of the collection, and that's sort of my domain. So it's prints that we show in our public screening series. It's prints that show in faculty-led series for classes. And it's a lot of original material from mainly filmmakers associated with Yale. So faculty members who have made films, students who made films while they were here or after they left here. And that's a big part of my job over the last 7 years that I've been here, has been seeking out original materials from people who don't have an archival home for those materials yet, and accessioning them, cataloging them, rehousing them, and in some cases preserving them. So we preserve somewhere between 2 and 4 films a year, still preserving on film, but of course also having a digital output as well. And then screening those films, often with filmmakers in person, and sharing them through print loans with other institutions around the world.
It should be noted that you do have some great alum from Yale that studied there, and you've actually been instituting your own series of conversations with some of these graduates that you can find at the Yale website.
Yeah, so we, film screening for the public is obviously a big part of what we do, and with that being off the table since last March, we came up with a sort of a way to try to connect our collection and audiences and alumni together, and I called them Treasure Talks, and there's a series of conversations. I've done about a dozen of them so far with alumni in the world of film who have chosen a film from our collection to talk about. And so this is a film that either they've seen it, in our print while they were a student here, or maybe it's just a film that means a lot to them that we happen to have in our collection. And so we talk about their time as students here and how it affected or led to their later career in film, and also about the film itself, and sort of what it means to them, why it's interesting, why it's significant. And then we've also ended with a little bit of a conversation usually about, movie going and what they've missed during this time when we haven't been gathering in groups in the dark to watch a movie.
Absolutely, and as I said, those can all be seen on the Yale website. It seems maybe too facile to go into a question about what you learned at the Selznick School, because you are doing film preservation as we speak. That's part of your mission and part of your job. But is there anything specific maybe about the Selznick School that you've sort of taken with you that's informed what you do?
Well, it's interesting. After leaving the Selznick School, I went to work at the Academy Film Archive, where I worked for 7 years as a public access coordinator and then as short film preservationist. And in those years, I was surrounded by other Selznick alums, and sort of working very specifically on my one task Heather Linville was another film preservationist, and Mark Toscano was another film preservationist. And I was focused on my very specific little niche of short films. And then I came to Yale, and I had to sort of do everything associated with film collections. And so at that point, I really relied on my Selznick education, because it was there that I was able to do all those different rotations. In the years since I had left the Selznick School, I had become very narrowly focused on film preservation. And so it took sort of looking back and drawing on those Selznick experiences when I got to Yale, when I realized that I was not only going to be doing a little bit of film preservation if I was lucky, but mainly cataloging, inspecting, repairing, grant writing, all of these different activities that we were educated in at the Selznick School. And so it was a really, really useful grounding to have from the Selznick School, especially once I got here and realized the sort of breadth of the different tasks. I also teach a graduate course every other year for film graduate students here, many of whom are in a 6-year program, a PhD program studying film, but haven't actually handled film.
Right.
And so we take them through the whole process of locating, purchasing, accessioning, inspecting, and researching a film. And I sort of think of it as a bit of a sort of Selznick School in 13 weeks. And obviously we can't go into nearly the depth that we did at school, but taking them through all the different steps and the processes to give them at least an idea of the life of a film as it travels through an archive, from being something that may be or mislabeled in a box to being something that is well researched and going on screen with an introduction and frame grabs and stills and notes and all that sort of stuff. The sort of things that we did at the Selznick School.
I think that's just a wonderful legacy that you are continuing here, in that not only are you doing sort of the job that you were trained for, but you've taken on that role. This is the 25th year of the school. So there's almost an entire generation of film archivists that have been trained here. And now you're taking that knowledge and applying it to at least making filmmakers aware, or training possibly another generation.
Exactly. Yeah. And often these film students have been so, deep and ensconced in the sort of academic nature of film, that it's so refreshing to see the sort of joy on their faces when they actually are holding some film and looking at it and saying, oh, that's why this looks like this on screen, or that explains why this soundtrack may be out of sync with the image, or that's actually what that looks like when you actually look at the physical item. So it's been really nice to be able to do that, and I owe all that, whatever I can teach them, to what I learned at the Selznick School, certainly.
Yeah, and even as filmmaking turns away from film itself, all of the tenets of production and aesthetics were all based on the physical film that it was made on for 100 years at the beginning. And so to have that connection to the beginnings, I think, was a great way to inform even production as we're going forward.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So you have an interesting pick for us that you're bringing to us today. There's a project associated with this. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah. So when you asked me if I would be interested in participating in this, you can, and needed to choose a film, you can go any number of ways. And knowing that it was, something associated with the august George Eastman Museum, I probably should have chosen some sort of canonical classic of the silent era, maybe a film that I associate with either the kind of films that I was exposed to in my time there, or something rather highbrow. Instead, I chose a film that is a kind of maybe possibly somewhat overlooked 80s high school movie. And the reason I chose 3 O'Clock High from 1987, if I'm allowed to introduce it at this moment, is because, over the last, 10 months of being at home and not being at work, and certainly most saliently not going out to the movies, I sort of needed a project. My wife is a teacher, and as the previous school year ended in June of 2020, she said to me, well, why don't we watch some 80s movies, something fun to sort of take our minds off the kind of darkness in the world right now. And, I bet there are a lot that we haven't seen, and it'd be fun to revisit some. And I thought, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Maybe we'll watch like 5 or 10 from each year, and we'll kind of go from 1980 to 1989 and see how that goes and see what we discover. And I should have known, knowing me, I wasn't able to do this kind of halfway. And so we watched, I think, 5 movies from 1980, maybe 10 movies from 1981. But by the time we got to the middle of the 80s, I was finding 40 and 50 movies from each year that I wanted to see. And I wanted to see movies I'd either never seen before, or movies that I had seen but hadn't seen in quite some time, to revisit them. And I was 5 in 1980 and 15 in 1990. So in between there was kind of the meat of my childhood. And so a lot of these movies that I wanted to see were movies that I only knew through newspaper advertisements, or what is Tequila Sunrise? Like, what? I don't know what this movie. Like these movies that sort of stuck with me, but I had never seen. And so when you have all the time in the world, you kind of can indulge in that. And so, I watched over 300 movies from the 1980s over the last 6 months of last year. And this was one of them. And this was one that really stuck out. A friend of mine said when he heard what I had done, I bet if you did something like, I bet if you watched movies from the 70s, even the worst movie from the 70s would be better than the best movie from the 80s. And I know that's not completely true, but it's probably mostly true. And he's probably right. The 80s were not maybe the best decade for a certain kind of cinema, but for other kinds of cinema, they were great years. And I think this movie really jumped out at me. I had seen it probably at age 13 or something on VHS, but didn't really remember it, and certainly didn't catch all of the brilliant things that are going on, especially visually, and in terms of the story that were going on in this film. And so I really enjoyed it, and that's why I picked it. I thought, what, we deserve to live a little, enjoy ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't actually seen it until you brought it up. So it was a first time watch for me, but I know that we've been communicating back and forth about how my opinion that the 70s really bled into the early 80s, at least, particularly with the dramas that were coming out at the time. But you focused more on sort of popular cinema. And as you go towards the second half of the decade, it does get into that really blockbustery kind of era where even the best films of the year, like Rain Man, are very sort of glossy and not connected to that previous decade at all. But one of the main subgenres of the 80s is the high school film. And you watched this, were you interested because of that subgenre, to compare it to some of the John Hughes films?
Yeah, well, so we watched all of John Hughes films, and throughout this whole project, sort of thinking what holds up, what doesn't. A lot of films I didn't watch any of the Back to the Future, didn't watch any Star Wars, because I'd seen those recently, and I was kind of setting a bar saying, I don't want to watch anything I've seen in the last 15 years again. And so trying to rediscover things either that I hadn't seen or hadn't seen since the first time. And the John Hughes movies absolutely hold up. I mean, he has a special way of understanding the teenage mind and heart that really still resonates today. And this is definitely a different kind of movie. But I remembered, like in just talking with you about it, I remembered the poster. I remembered that VHS box, that great Drew Struzan art where the hand is coming out of the clock and is holding the body of the kid who doesn't even really look like Casey Simasco on that art. But anyway, I remembered it, and I remembered the face of the bully. And so Buddy Revel's face just stood out to me, and I knew I'd never really seen that actor anywhere else. And so I wanted to revisit it. And, once it opened and I saw Barry Sonnenfeld's name as lighting consultant, I was immediately intrigued. And the opening few shots have this really over the top, camera movements and cranes and just really interesting visual stuff. And it's a lot of sort of really fun images and fun camera angles from inside a washing machine or inside the lockers at school, that I really was sort of taken by the kind of visual creativity. And I had on my radar to watch Rattle and Hum as well, from 1988, and putting the two together, that they were both directed by Phil Joanou, who had made a ton of music videos and started out in Amazing Stories under Steven Spielberg, and then doing a little bit of research on the background of the film itself and how Joanou got it and how Spielberg ended up taking his name off of the film because he was sort of unhappy with the tone or the content. I just sort of felt like this film had a lot going on, and was maybe not a kind of click examination like the John Hughes films would have been, but was more of a really kind of smart kind of adaptation of or a laying on of a kind of Western rubric onto a kind of high school film. And it's I watched it again last night. It was the first 80s movie I've watched since sort of finishing the project, and I watched it again, and it really held up. I really enjoyed it, and I saw a lot more this time than I hadn't seen a few months ago.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when you mentioned targeting films that you sort of remembered from newspaper ads and posters. And that was always the exact thing that I remembered about 3 o'clock high, even without having seen it, was that poster, the working at Blockbuster and seeing that cover art every time you go through the comedy section. The other thing that I remembered about this was maybe like HBO trailers or something, where it's the quick zoom on the clock as it's ringing and the quick zoom on his face. You bring up Barry Sonnenfeld, and I think part of that attraction is that he had actually worked with the Coens. So there is that sort of soup of creativity that he was exposed to and was part of before he got into like the Addams Family and Men in Black films. So this was an earlier, younger version of Sonnenfeld that was really playing a lot with the camera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much going on. These really sort of ambitious crane shots. Like I'm thinking of one in the pep rally where the camera goes up this tower of cheerleaders who are stacked together in the middle of the gym, and then it goes all the way over and comes right on in on is it Jerry, right?
Yes.
Yeah. On Jerry's face as he is kind of about to see his arch enemy appear in the corner of the gym. And I mean, it's sort of much more hyperactive and kind of over the top than you would typically find in a high school film, or that such a type of film even really deserves or is appropriate for. It feels kind of just out of place, but in a really fun way. And there's so much going on in addition to the visuals with the writing, the sort of way that as Jerry goes through his day, each of his classes is kind of a metaphor for his own plight. You've got, or each of the activities that he partakes in. Sort of, you've got the pep rally where the body's being dismembered and the sort of blood glitter is kind of spewing out, which he thinks is probably going to happen to him when he gets into his fight at 3 o'clock. Or you've got the kind of myth that the teacher is reading about Hector, in this fight. And then my favorite part, which, because I always love movies and especially 16 millimeter classroom projection, is this science educational film about this, giant, what is a scorpion eating a cricket, and it's sort of a metaphor for Buddy's, plight. But I'd love to know, but I think they might have made that film for this film, because it says, it has a title card and everything, and it says Yerpy Productions, which I guess is a play on Irpy, the precursor to Encyclopedia Britannica films. So I'd really love to know if they did that. But there's also the joy of those two amateur filmmakers who want to go to UCLA Film School, and they're walking around trying to make this documentary about the fight, and while they're doing that, they're neglecting the projector, and of course the film comes out of the gate and melts, which is of course a perfect thing, a visual to have in a film.
And we're probably doing this backwards in that we haven't talked about the plot of the film at all. But I do want to pick up on something that you mentioned about the sort of heightened state of the filmmaking that goes into this film. And it's, if you consider looking back on our teenage years and how, even this kind of obstacle, it was sort of the height of our obsession at that time. That was as important to us as high schoolers as, say, Gary Cooper's situation in High Noon.
Right.
So to have that kind of cinematic effort put behind to heighten how exactly Jerry feels within this situation, I think was a really interesting way, particularly when, John Hughes is doing very standard sort of classical Hollywood framing and camera movement.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, the plot in a nutshell is that Jerry, young student reporter, gets tagged with with reporting on the new kid, this fearsome bully who comes to school and through a series of unfortunate decisions ends up being told that they will fight at the end of the day, and that he will undoubtedly, not stack up to this giant who is going to sort of, pull him to pieces at the end of the day. And so he spends his day trying to either get out of it, avoid it, forestall it, and it's interesting. I'm trying to figure out at the end of the movie why Spielberg might have felt unhappy with the result and wanted to sort of remove his name from the production credit of the film. And I think that probably in some way led to the film's lackluster performance at the box office, and perhaps its renaissance such as it has had through the video era. And it's not to give it away, but they do fight. There is a violent sort of climax at the end, and and is it the way that the fight transpires that Jerry is sort of he survives not through wiles or cleverness or peacefulness, but through other means? Is that the problem? Is that why the film was distasteful to Spielberg, or is it more that it's sort of less of a kind of a John Hughes or Robert Zemeckis approach, and more of a sort of Martin Scorsese approach? The influence of After Hours on Joanou when he was making this film has been reported. I mean, the film was called After School for a while until the name was changed to 3 O'Clock High. And the kind of After Hours, this manic sense that you need to get something, you need to either retrieve something or achieve something, and there are all these obstacles in your way, and many of them are totally surreal. There's certainly a kinship between these two films in that way.
And I love that subversion too. Like you say, it's a violent confrontation at the end, whereas most of these films would focus on a way to not use violence to solve your problems. But it's also he's not a screw up. He's a good kid and a good student. And the way he keeps on getting pushed towards this confrontation is that he's been assigned an article for his school paper to interview this new kid, Buddy Revell, that's coming into the school. So in his effort to be a people pleaser and do his job, what his assignment was, he gets pushed into this situation with Buddy and sort of keeps after it and keeps making mistakes that just make things worse and worse.
Yeah, the film, it's a great one of those sort of day and one film in a single day kind of stories, and it's necessarily sort of episodic in a way. You see the clock ticking. There are countless shots of clocks that sort of peg your time of day as the movie goes on. But there are so many great sort of just actors. I wouldn't even call them character actors, but just wonderful actors playing wonderful little roles throughout the film. There are 3 levels of disciplinary trouble that Jerry gets in, and each of the actors, whether it's just the security guard Mitch Pileggi, or then we go up to the wonderfully named Wojtek Dolinsky, I think is his name, who's the sort of head of discipline, and then the principal, who I had just seen as the crazy warden in the John Voight film Runaway Train. He's now the principal here, and so each of those levels is played by an amazing actor, and then you get Philip Baker Hall coming in a sadly too small role, but still very potent, as the juvenile department of the sheriff's office, who comes in when there is a theft at the school store. But it's really populated with a bunch of wonderful actors doing really putting in really fun performances.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot of names. Like, as I watched this for the first time, there was so many people that I recognized or may have even known had taken part in the film. But starting with Joanou, who, as you say, had directed music videos, and this was his first feature film. But as I went to college, Rattle and Hum was a big one for me, and Final Analysis with Richard Gere and Kim Basinger, that came out in the early 90s was big for me. So Joanou was always a name that I would know. State of Grace,
right.
A mob film, an Irish mob film, takes place in New York City, another great film that's overlooked. But Casey Siemasko was going to be, a big star around this time. He was in Young Guns. Not long after, late 80s, early 90s, he was in this film called Breaking In with Burt Reynolds that I
I'm
remember.
going to recommend that one. That was one of the last films I watched, Bill Forsyth. Such a great movie, and I had never heard of it. Yeah.
Richard Tyson, who plays Buddy Revell, I remember very distinctly from a short-lived series called Hardball that was on TV with John Ashton from Beverly Hills Cop. And he was also the main villain in Kindergarten Cop that was trying to find, or Schwarzenegger was trying to find him in there. And of course, just to have Mitch Pileggi, pre-X-Files, show up and be some sort of tamed down version of the skinhead that he eventually played in Sons of Anarchy. It's just all of these connections, bringing us in with this sort of wild camera work and very focused story was a joy to watch and sort of reminisce about.
Good. I'm glad. I had no idea when I recommended it to you and you said you hadn't seen it. Like, oh boy, Jared's opinions of me is really going to take a nosedive if he watches this movie and really doesn't like it. So one of the other things I really like about the movie is the soundtrack. The Tangerine Dream does the music, which is really great. But then there's also this terrific song at the beginning and end that it sounds sort of reminiscent of Squeeze from that era, and it's just a catchy pop tune, and it seems like it could have been a hit, but apparently wasn't. I think the film is just, it's filled with a lot of, as you said, a lot of really enjoyable details, whether it's the story, the cast, the camera work, the music, and I think it's a little gem from that period and possibly overlooked. Though I know it certainly has its fans.
So are there other films you said you were thinking about talking about Breaking In that you associate with this film that from your research that you would want to recommend?
Well, yeah, I mean, Breaking In was one. I had seen Gregory's Girl earlier in the project, and I had seen Local Hero years ago, but didn't really know Bill Forsyth at all, and beyond that film. And so Gregory's Girl was, of course, amazing. I limited most of my films to American films, but did watch a couple of English films here and there in the project. And then, yeah, Breaking In was a real shocker to me. I had no idea it existed. Set in Portland, and about this sort of, a kind of shaggy dog tale of safe crackers, and it sort of had a weird kind of proto Wes Anderson feel about some of it, and Casey Siemasko was actually someone who showed up in more of these films that I watched than almost any other actor. He was in Class, and he was in Stand By Me, and of course I didn't watch the Back to the Future films for this project, but he was 3D in the first two Back to the Future films, and he's really solid. I really like him as a screen presence. He's totally great in this film as this kind of, he makes the straight A kid who runs the school store. You might think of that kid as kind of insufferable, but he makes him a kind of, he's a kind of really likable person who is stuck. He's torn. He wants to keep his good disciplinary record. He wants to keep his transcript clean, but also he's just pushed. He's driven to extremes by the fear of this new bully character who's coming to school. Just one other thing on that point. The film opens, I mean, after the great opening sequence of Jerry getting ready for school, there's this amazing tracking shot going into the school where the camera bounces from group to group to group, all these different students who are all sort of spreading these insane rumors about how terrible this new student is and how fearsome he is and who he might have killed or maimed at all the previous schools he'd been at. And it's just really, really well done. It's just wonderfully executed. It's really fun. It's beautifully timed. And also Yardley Smith, who voices for The Simpsons, is one of the first students you see, and then you see her again at the end of the film. So that's kind of a neat little thing, and you immediately recognize her voice, even though you're not ready to have that be there. So
yeah, and that shot in particular really sort of emphasizes the way that almost like a virus that these kinds of rumors spread. So it's going from one person to another, just sort of floating on the air. And as you sort of catch it in the corners of your hearing, it sort of builds the legend as it gets closer and closer to the school.
Right. Yeah. And it amplifies, it sort of gets worse. Maybe he's 6 feet tall, maybe he's 7 feet tall by the next time someone tells it. But yeah, that also sort of describes the kind of speed and spread of rumors in high school. And, even moments after the gauntlet has been thrown down, somehow other people already know about it and are already talking to him about it, including, I don't know, did you see that was Paul Feig, who was the hall monitor, who comes and taps him on the shoulder and says, "I hear you're going to fight Buddy Revell. Are you a black belt?" Like it's a very brief line from him. But if you close your eyes and you imagine a bow tie, you can see that that's him. So.
Well, that is wonderful. Thank you for bringing this to us. The film is currently available to rent on many of the digital platforms such as Amazon and Apple TV and YouTube. So you can go out and find this film there, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as we did. If you're around our age, perhaps some of the nostalgia will take effect, and you can enjoy all these things that we saw. But before I let you go, Brian, I have been doing a little questionnaire with a lot of the people that I've been having conversations with, just about your history with cinema. And as I know that you and I both have a venue that we want to get back up and running, about your history with cinema.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Question number one, what is your first cinematic memory?
It's a good question. So I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, from the son of two not particularly movie-going parents. We had a great theater in Anchorage called the Fireweed Theater, which was my sort of main multiplex of youth, until a couple more came along as I got into my teenage years and started going to more movies. I wish I had a more solid memory of going to see Empire Strikes Back on I think maybe a pre-Return of the Jedi re-release. So I would have been maybe 7, something like that. But I have to say, it's not my earliest movie-going memory, but my strongest from that period or from that theater was going to a friend's birthday party on the opening night of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And I know this is late. It was our 14th. It was his 14th birthday, so it was not a particularly early memory, but this was the biggest cinema in all of Alaska. It was a huge screen, and we got down, and the THX logo comes on, and the speakers just blow you back. And it was not until, of course, it was a terrific movie, and I did just watch it again a few weeks ago with my daughter, and it was so much fun. Absolutely held up, so great. But the funny thing is, I was doing some research into my own movie-going history and found out just a few years ago that we had actually seen a 70mm print. And that is only sort of significant to the much, if possible, nerdier me than I was at 14 now. But I was really intrigued by the idea that in 1989 that 70mm prints had made their way up to Alaska, and that for my buddy Brent's 14th birthday, that he and I and a bunch of our friends, after having pizza, went over to the Fireweed Theater and watched this movie in 70mm, which of course I wouldn't have known or cared about at 14. But so yeah, I didn't grow up watching a ton of movies. It was really 12, 13, 14, and then especially like when I got a license and started being able to drive myself around, that I really started going to the movies. And by the end, by high school, we had a local independent art house theater, which Anchorage doesn't even have anymore. But there was this great period in the 80s and 90s when the Capri Theater existed in Anchorage. And I used to go and watch whatever Rand was showing there. That's where I first saw Delicatessen, which has become one of my favorite movies. That's where I first saw, Orson Welles, Kurosawa, anything, remotely out of the mainstream. I saw there. And so that was a really formative experience for me, and then led to my further interest in film into college. So
I have a couple of confessions based on your answer there. The first is that my first cinematic memory was Star Wars, so the original one.
Yeah.
back in 77 or 78 when we saw it. So it connects with your Empire Strikes Back
Yeah.
there, but also that on that day, that Wednesday, that Last Crusade came out, I skipped school. You know, the three of us went down to the Stone Ridge Plaza and went to see early afternoon show of Last Crusade.
Nice.
You've sort of anticipated, I think, the second question, which was memories of a theater when you were growing up. Obviously, there were several different ones that you went to, but is there one specific you have fond memories of?
Well, I think it has to be the Capri, because it was in a little strip mall, and it was a tiny little place, and I didn't really know this until, well, I guess I sort of knew about it in high school, but it was a really sort of small independent theater that was barely making it, and like a lot of theaters did, it veered from sort of mainstream to foreign, and then when it wasn't making much money, they would have do a lot of adult films, and sort of had an audience that way that would help keep it afloat. And so it was kind of this thing that sort of shifted and sort of covered many different bases during that period, which is not really sort of the sort of thing that really exists anymore. Right. And for me, it really helped encourage my sort of love of cinema, because every few months or maybe twice a year, they would have a poster and stills sale. So they'd, gather all the posters that they'd been sent by the distributors over the year that they didn't need anymore. And so I was able to sort of go through and be able to build a kind of a connection with these movies that I had seen there and loved by taking home a poster and putting it up in my room. I bought posters for Roadside Prophets and Flirting and Delicatessen that ended up in my college dorm and sparked conversations with people, and that I still have today, with like blue tack on the back and all ratty and full of holes and everything. But being able to sort of get that sense that there were these movies that maybe had been hits in New York or Los Angeles and were eventually, like a year later, making it to Alaska, or the idea of a restoration. I think that's the first time I ever heard of a restoration. I saw like the restored Vertigo or the restored Rear Window made it up there. And so that was a really formative thing, and something that definitely kind of clued me into this world of the history of cinema, of classic film and of foreign film and of art film that, I wasn't really getting at the local video store, and certainly wasn't getting at the Fireby Theater.
What is your favorite sensory experience about going to the cinema?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Gosh, I'd have to say that it is sort of the moment after the lights have gone down, but before the film has gone up. I like to be as ignorant as possible about a film. If it doesn't take much to get me to want to see a film. Like, just the film existing is enough for me. You don't have to sell it to me. You don't have to tell me much about it. Even just like that the film was made in a certain era, or is from a certain country, or is the adaptation of a certain writer, or is the work of a certain cinematographer or actor. That's usually enough. So I oftentimes I don't know much about a film that I'm going into. And so that moment when, you've gotten your seat and things have calmed down and there's this anticipation in the room, and then the lights go down, and then, then you're off. And that first moment when the light hits the screen, I also just love the often the sort of the roughness or the weirdness or the unexpectedness with which a film print can start. Whether it's, flash frames or some splices because there was some damage, or there's a weird censor card, or there's a test strip girl or something going on at the beginning of a print that makes you understand that it's not just a file that's being played, which is fine for what it is, but there's something about the sort of mystery and the weirdness of film that makes each of those artifacts unique and makes the experience of watching them a unique experience.
There seems to be a lot of sort of textuality about several of the things that you've brought up here, whether it's students touching the film or your year here at the Selznick, or the preservation, and just the film nerdiness of the differences between each individual print and the sort of history that comes along with that. When we announce here at the Dryden that a certain print belongs to Martin Scorsese, it has extra cachet that it brings with it because it was sort of in that same physical space as him. Before we go on, is there anything you want to expand on that?
Well, I think that's really one of the reasons that I love doing my job is that I'm getting materials that each have a history. They have a story, and whether or not I know much of that story or can tell much of that story from the item itself, it varies with each one. But for example, I'll have a film that a group of filmmakers shot in New Haven when the Black Panthers were on trial, and there was a massive demonstration against this in 1970. And we finished working on this film and were able to screen it with the filmmakers. It did a little video interview, which was the first sort of lockdown release that we made, where for the 50th anniversary of this event, we shared a preservation of this film online, which was a first for us, and a conversation about that film. And just handling the reversal originals that were in the cameras, that they used to film this was just a really sort of special thing for me. And even show prints that I'll get that will have funny notes from projectionists on them. There's a core that I keep that says something like M&M cores melts in your mouth, not in your hands. And someone had written this whole little poem about a film core on a core that was buried inside a print that I picked up somewhere. And so now I look at it every day when I inspect films. It just sort of sits on my shelf. And just, the idea that these things were objects that had weight and took up space and had to be cared for and were built up and broken down and shipped from here to there and sort of eventually made their way. I kind of get a great sense of relief knowing that these are sort of orphans that we're taking in. I've given you a home. This is your forever home. You're going to stay here. And you don't have to worry about being spliced anymore. And I mean, the more I talk about it, it sounds ridiculous, like I'm talking about these as though they're children. But still, the sort of physicality and the labor that it took to put these prints on screen, and the skill and the technical awareness that the projectionists had to share these, to share the vision that is encased in these films with audiences. It just sort of speaks to me when I inspect them, and it's just something that I really love about what I do.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
Thanks.
Question number 4. Where do you sit when you go to the cinema?
Where do I sit? It's really interesting. I just screened a film for the first time, a print this morning for the first time in 11 months in the theater, our old theater, completely alone. And there, when I do my QC screenings, I always sit 4th row center, just because I want to have a really good eye on, I want to be centered, because it's just important to be able to get a really good view of every corner of the screen and light falling on all the screen equally and everything. And there's no one else around, so I don't need to worry about who's in front of me or anything like that. But when I was at the Academy, and we would have the ability to go to screenings on the weekends of new films that came out for all the members and staff of the Academy. And this is a 2,000 seat theater or whatever. And so, there were plenty of good seats, but there were also plenty of people. And so you'd always, we want to make sure that you were, sitting in the right place. I would always sort of sit kind of 5th, 6th row on the right-hand side of the left-hand section. So I was sort of all the way on the left, but on the right aisle, on the left side of that aisle. So there was no one directly in front of me. You're kind of looking at the screen this way. So you're at a bit of an angle, but I could always stretch my legs out into the aisle, and always make sure I didn't have any heads in front of me. But that only works when you have, 2 aisles in a cinema. If it's and seating to the left and to the right of them. If it's just one block, there's nowhere really like that unless you're, sort of facing the wrong direction. So anyway, I tend to sit in the first quarter of the screen, or of the seats. I like to be close. I like to see the image before anyone else gets. No, I like being close. I like being overwhelmed by the image.
Yeah, another confession connection. I have a seat here in the Dryden Theater that's 4 rows back, 4 seats in. That
Nice.
If I have any of my choice, that's exactly where I go. So again, slightly off at an angle, but being overwhelmed by that screen.
Yeah, definitely.
So one last question, less cinema related or less experience related. Is there a book that you can recommend that people pick up while they're home to read about cinema, about Yale, about the
Mm.
history that you think would be good?
Good question. When we all started staying home in the middle of March, I was in the middle of a couple of books by Peter Bogdanovich.
Mm.
Who the Devil Made It, and I believe it's Who the Hell's in It, are his two books that profile or that sort of collect his interviews and reminiscences and connections with actors, Who the Hell's in It, and directors, Who the Devil Made It. And they're really great. I mean, Bogdanovich is a great writer and has an amazing memory, and also just has had an incredible sort of life of experiences with people, you know, be it silent film directors all the way up through, and these books go sort of through the 1990s. And just reading, you know, like I had seen probably half a dozen Howard Hawks movies in my life, but had never really sort of thought of the entire span of Hawks' career. And before this 80s project, I embarked on a kind of taster, a smaller version, which was to watch every film Howard Hawks made that I could find.
Wow.
And so, you know, Hawks' career spanned the silent era up through 1970. So this huge swath of you know 20th century filmmaking. And it was great to be inspired by the interviews and to read all about Hawks sort of behind the scenes. And just you know, I think of Billy Wilder as someone who's incredibly versatile and can do all these things. You know, the war film, the noir, the comedy. But Hawks was just as versatile. And I mean, the breadth of films. I mean, he's known for his westerns, but I mean, there are so many different types of films that he made that he did so well. And it was great to see these recurring tropes, these sort of, you know, the gag where the woman's skirt has fallen down and the man puts his coat up behind it, which you see in Bringing Up Baby, but it's in a couple of other films as well. So you know, there are so many great films that I hadn't seen, and so I recommend that book, especially Who the Devil Made It, just because it's such a great look at these directors' careers. I'm reading about Leo McCarey now, and I realized that I've probably only seen 3 or 4 Leo McCarey films. And so, you know, each of these chapters is sort of spawning a new project in my mind. But it's books like that I really enjoy because they inspire me to return to the screen. You know, I haven't been reading as much. Instead, I've been watching a lot of movies. But I've returned to reading this year, and I'm not only going to read books about movies, but one like that can be really instrumental in helping, you know, sort of nudge you to rediscover or discover for the first time some films that you hadn't seen.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate it, Brian, for taking the time to sit down with us and have a conversation about a film that probably most people out there in the audience haven't seen.
Yeah,
And
well, I
we can
hope
inspire
people
them.
can, find it and watch it and hopefully enjoy it.
Well, we hope that we get back to film exhibition again soon at some point in time. And we hope that everything goes well for you at Yale, and look forward to seeing you again sometime down the road.
Yes, thank you, Jared. I look forward to that as well. I can't wait to return for the next Nitrate Picture Show, whenever it may be, and my annual trip up to Rochester, which I love and miss. And it's always so great to see all of you up there. So thank you again for doing this and for inviting me.